By the end of the day, his fingers are numb, his eyes burn, and his shoulder feels carved from stone. Yet he has written only 3 pages. In the 14th century monastery, this isn't failure, it's mastery. Today, we are not looking at a specific year, but rather a specific atmosphere. A damp, stone-walled room in a Benedictine monastery in 14th century England. We are going to deconstruct, minute by minute, the 14-hour workday of a professional copyist. This is not a story of high adventure. It is a story of chemistry, geometry, and endurance. It is a story of oak galls crushed into powder, of goose feathers cured in hot sand, and of the agonizing, beautiful discipline required to turn the skin of a calf into the Word of God. To understand the scribe, you must first understand the silence. The scriptorium is not merely a library, it is a factory of prayer. In the Benedictine tradition, labor is a form of devotion. Laborare est orare. To work is to pray. But unlike the laborers in the fields who can shout to the oxen, or the cooks in the kitchen who can clang their pots, the scribe works in a no-talking zone that is strictly enforced. The 9th century monastery of St. Gall explicitly designated the scriptorium as a place of total silence. If a scribe needed a new book, he did not ask for it. He used a complex system of hand signals. To ask for a missal, he would extend his hands and make a motion like turning pages. If he needed a pagan text, something secular, he would scratch his ear like a dog, a silent joke implying that non-Christian writers were akin to animals. The day begins long before the sun touches the stained glass. It begins with the bell. At midnight, the great iron bell of the abbey tolls for matins. The monk rises from a straw mattress in the common dormitory. He sleeps in his habit, his tunic and belt, so he is ready instantly. The dormitory is unheated. In winter, the water in the wash basin might have a crust of ice. He moves in the dark, guided by memory and the shuffling footsteps of his brothers, down the night stairs and into the choir for the first office of the day. The chanting of matins takes about an hour. Then comes Lauds at 3 a.m. Between these services, there is a period of reading or meditation. But for the scribe, the true work begins after prime, the 6 a.m. service. By the time the scribe enters the scriptorium, he has been awake for hours, his mind cleared by chant, his body cold. The scriptorium itself is designed for light, not comfort. It is often located on the north side of the cloister to catch the steady, diffuse northern light that doesn't glare or shift as violently as southern exposure. The windows are large but unglazed in older monasteries, covered only by oilcloth or wooden shutters, meaning the room is essentially the same temperature as the outside air. Fireplaces are forbidden near the books for obvious reasons. Fire is the great enemy of the library. So the scribe relies on thick wool robes, fingerless gloves, and sometimes a heated brick wrapped in cloth at his feet. Before a single word can be written, the materials must be engineered. A medieval book is not paper, it is parchment or vellum. This is skin. The distinction is specific. Parchment can be sheep or goat, but vellum, vitellinum, is exclusively calfskin. The preparation of this surface is a loud, smelly, industrial process that usually happens outside the scriptorium, but the scribe must understand it intimately to work with the material. The skin is soaked in a lime solution for 3 to 10 days to loosen the hair. It is then draped over a curved wooden beam and scraped with a 2-handled knife called a lunellum, from the Latin for little moon, due to its crescent shape. The flesh and fat are stripped away. Then, While still wet, the skin is stretched on a wooden frame, pulled tight by pegs. As it dries under tension, the collagen fibers in the skin realign, becoming a flat, durable, white sheet. But when it arrives at the scribe's desk, it is not yet ready for ink. It is greasy. It has hair follicles. If you write on it now, the ink will bead up or bleed. The scribe takes up a piece of pumice stone, volcanic rock, and vigorously rubs the surface of the sheet. This is called pouncing. It raises a fine nap, like velvet, which gives the ink something to grip. He might then rub chalk or cuttlefish bone powder into the surface to whiten it further. The sheet is then cut. A single calfskin might yield only 4 double-sided pages of a large Bible. To produce a giant Bible, or a large antiphonal, an entire herd of cattle, hundreds of animals, must be slaughtered. The weight of this cost is palpable in the room. To ruin a page is to waste a life. Now, the scribe must lay out the grid. He cannot simply start writing. He takes a tool called a punctorium, an awl or a compass with a sharp metal point. He moves down the margin of the page, poking tiny holes at regular intervals. Poke, poke, poke. These are the guide holes. Once the holes are pricked, he takes a straight edge and a piece of lead, or a plummet, the ancestor of the pencil, or sometimes the back of his knife, and he scores the lines across the page, connecting the dots. He presses hard enough to leave a groove that can be seen on the other side of the skin, creating a raised guide for the reverse page. This geometry is sacred. The ratio of the text block to the margins is often governed by the golden ratio, or specific harmonic proportions, 2:3, 5:8. The large margins are not wasted space. They are handles for the reader's fingers so they do not touch the holy text, and they are real estate for the gloss, the commentary that future scholars will add. With the page ruled, the scribe turns to his tools. On his desk, which is steeply angled at 45 degrees or more to prevent ink from pooling in the quill, sit 2 essential items: the inkhorn and the knife. The knife is just as important as the pen. In his left hand, or non-dominant hand, the scribe holds the knife constantly while he writes. It serves 2 purposes. First, he uses the tip of the knife to hold the parchment down. The natural oils from human skin can damage the prepared surface, so he never touches the page with his bare fingers. Second, the knife is an eraser. If he makes an error, he does not cross it out. He waits for the ink to dry, then gently scrapes the top layer of skin off the parchment, physically removing the mistake. And then, the pen. The quill is a marvel of natural engineering. It is almost always a flight feather from a goose, specifically from the leading edge of the wing. Scribes prefer feathers from the left wing of the bird because the natural curve of the feather fits better in the right hand, curving away from the writer's face. A raw feather is useless. It is filled with marrow and is too soft. It must be dutched or tempered. The scribe plunges the barrel of the feather into hot sand, around 350 degrees Fahrenheit. The heat cooks the proteins in the quill, turning the opaque, fatty barrel into a clear, hard, plastic-like tube. The scribe then uses his knife to cut the nib. This is a surgical operation. He makes a scoop cut to open the barrel, a slit up the center to create the tines that will hold the ink via capillary action, and then chisels the tip to a perfect square or oblique angle depending on the script style. Textura, quadrata, bastarda, or rotunda. A dull knife means a ragged nib, which means a splattered page. The knife must be razor sharp. The ink he dips into is not simple dye. It is a chemical bite. The most common ink of the High Middle Ages is iron gall ink. Its creation is a slow biological process. It starts with the oak gall, a small, round growth found on oak trees. These are not nuts. They are tumors formed when a gall wasp lays an egg in the tree bud. The tree reacts by surrounding the egg in a tannin-rich sphere. The scribe, or the monastery's ink maker, crushes these galls into a coarse powder and soaks them in rainwater or white wine for days. This extracts the gallatanic acid. Then, he adds vitriol, ferrous sulfate, a green crystal salt often mined from copperas stones. When the iron meets the tannin, a reaction occurs. The liquid turns a deep, violent, purple-black. To thicken it, he adds gum arabic, the sap of the acacia tree, which allows the ink to flow smoothly from the quill and bind to the parchment. This ink is alive. It is acidic. Over centuries, it essentially burns itself into the skin. If the mixture is too acidic, it will eventually eat a hole right through the page, a phenomenon archivists call ink corrosion. If you look at a manuscript from 1400 today, the letters are raised and crusty, etched into the animal skin forever. The scribe dips the quill. He shakes it once to remove the excess. He places his hand on the desk, pinky finger extended for balance, knife in the left hand holding the skin. He begins, minim, minim, minim. The script style known as blackletter or Gothic is defined by its vertical strokes. A word like minimum consists almost entirely of short, vertical lines called minims. To the untrained eye, it looks like a picket fence. The scribe must maintain absolute consistency. Every letter M must be the exact same width as every letter N or U. The spacing between the letters must be equal to the width of the vertical strokes themselves, creating a picket fence rhythm of black ink and white space that gives the page a woven texture, hence the name textura. The speed is glacial. A professional scribe might finish 3 or 4 pages a day. A high-quality Bible could take 15 months to complete. If the scribe is working on a luxury commission, he leaves spaces, blank squares, where the rubricator, the person who paints the red letters, and the illuminator, who applies the gold leaf, will come in later. He might write a tiny guide letter in the margin to tell the illuminator which letter goes in the box. The physical toll of this work is something that medieval sources complain about constantly. We tend to think of writing as a wrist action, but medieval scribes did not rest their wrist on the page, remember the oils. They wrote with their arm floating, the movement coming from the shoulder and elbow. Try holding your arm out, unsupported, making microscopic movements for 6 hours. The muscles in the back spasm. The neck locks up. The eyes water from staring at black marks on white skin in dim light. In the margins of surviving manuscripts, we find the complaints of these anonymous workers. These are tiny, unauthorized messages left by scribes who thought no one would read them. In a 9th century manuscript from Leon, a scribe wrote, "The page is hairy and the ink is thin." Another wrote, "New parchment, bad ink, I say nothing more." In a copy of a grammar text, a scribe wrote in the margin, "Now I've written the whole thing. For Christ's sake, give me a drink." And perhaps the most famous, found in a dozen different books, writing is excessive drudgery. It crooks your back, it dims your sight, it twists your stomach and your sides. They also track the time. A scribe might write in the margin, "It is now noon," or "I am very cold." These are the voices of the quiet shift, reaching out across 1,000 years to tell us that their back hurt, Lunch is the main meal of the day, taken after sext, noon. In a Benedictine house, the food is simple but sufficient. Pottage, a thick vegetable stew. Bread, perhaps fish or cheese, and ale. Ale is crucial. Water is often unsafe, but the weak fermentation of small beer kills the bacteria. The monks eat in silence in the refectory, listening to a brother reading aloud from the Bible or the lives of the saints. There is no conversation. You focus on the nourishment. After the meal, there might be a brief period of rest or meridian, particularly in summer when the days are long. But in winter, the daylight is a dying resource. The scribe rushes back to his desk. As the afternoon wears on, the light in the scriptorium changes. The north light fades into a blue twilight. This is the danger zone. As the light fails, the risk of error increases. A scribe might light a tallow candle, but he must be careful. Tallow is rendered animal fat, sheep or cow. It smells rancid when it burns. Unlike the sweet beeswax candles used on the altar, the smoke is greasy. If he leans too close, a drop of hot grease could land on the page, ruining a week's work. If he snuffs the candle improperly, a spark could land in the straw rushes on the floor. Scribes often used a glass sphere filled with water to focus the candlelight onto their work, a primitive magnifying lens. This orb of water would cast a bright, clean pool of light on the specific line he was writing, leaving the rest of the room in shadow. The work continues until Vespers, the evening prayer, usually around sunset. The scribe puts down his quill. He cleans the nib carefully. Dried ink will ruin the cut. He caps the inkhorn. He covers the parchment with a heavy cloth or a wooden board to protect it from the dust and the rats that roam the monastery at night. He looks at what he has done. 3 columns of text, perhaps 2,000 words, a fraction of the book of Isaiah. He has not created the words. He has merely transmitted them. He is a conduit. He leaves the scriptorium, his fingers stained black with iron gall, his right shoulder throbbing. He walks to the choir for Vespers, then a light supper, collation, and finally Compline, the night prayer. By 8 or 9 o'clock p.m., the monastery is silent again. The great silence begins, which lasts until the next morning. The scribe lies down on his straw mattress in the dark. He closes his eyes, and in the silence, he sees the picket fence of black letters marching behind his eyelids. Minim, minim, minim. He sleeps. And 4 hours later, the bell for matins will ring again. To understand the workflow of the scriptorium, one must look away from the desk and toward the center of the room, or perhaps to a heavy oak door at the far end. The scriptorium was not a collective of freelancers working on their own passions. It was a rigid hierarchy, a factory floor of devotion, where every stroke of the pen was monitored, catalogued, and quality controlled. At the top of this silent pyramid stood the armarius, sometimes called the librarian or the precentor. The armarius was the absolute authority within these walls. His title comes from the armarium, the great wooden chest or cupboard where the finished books were stored. In a time when a single volume could be worth the price of a small farm or a vineyard, the man who held the keys to the armarium held the wealth of the monastery in his belt pouch. The duties of the armarius were vast and administrative. He did not merely organize the books, he engineered the entire production line. When the bell rang for work to begin, it was the armarius who unlocked the heavy cabinets. The smell that drifted out would have been distinct. The musk of old leather, the sharp tang of birchwood shelves, and the dry, dusty scent of parchment. He was the one who assigned the work. This was a decision based on logistics and talent, not preference. A monk did not choose to write a psalter because he felt spiritually moved by the Psalms that morning. The armarius chose him. He knew the hands of his workforce. He knew that Brother Thomas had a steady, heavy hand, suitable for the large Gothic textura script used in the great Bibles that would sit on the high altar. He knew that Brother Anselm had a tighter, more cursive hand, better for the glosses, the small commentary written in the margins, or for administrative charters and legal deeds. The assignment process was physical. The armarius would hand the scribe the exemplar, the original book to be copied. This was a moment of high trust. The exemplar might be a loan from another monastery, borrowed with a heavy deposit of gold or property. If the scribe spilled ink on the exemplar, it was a diplomatic incident. The armarius would inspect the scribe's station to ensure the desk was clean, the inkhorn stable, and the angle correct before the precious original was laid down. Under the armarius were the distinct classes of scribes. The distinction was usually drawn between the antiquarii and the juniores. The antiquarii were the veterans. These were men who had spent decades hunched over the desk. Their backs were permanently curved, their fingers often stained indelibly, but their muscle memory was flawless. They were entrusted with the restoration of old, decaying manuscripts, a delicate surgery where they had to trace over fading letters without damaging the rotting parchment beneath. They were also the ones who wrote the great books, the luxury volumes illuminated with gold and blue. The juniores, or the novices, sat elsewhere. Their work was the grunt work of the literary world. They did not start with Bibles. They started with letters, lists, and school books. They practiced their script on wax tablets or scraps of waste parchment called offcuts until their hand was steady enough to be trusted with a full sheet of vellum. It was the armarius who decided when a junior was ready to graduate. He would walk the rows looking over shoulders, examining the consistency of the minims and the straightness of the ascenders. The armarius also controlled the supply chain. He was the keeper of the raw materials. Parchment was expensive, but so were the consumables. Chalk, pumice, razors, and candles were dispensed by him. If a scribe's quill wore down, and they wore down quickly, often needing to be recut every few pages, he couldn't simply grab a feather from a pile. He had to present the dull quill to the armarius or his deputy to prove it was no longer usable. This prevented waste, but it also reinforced the discipline. Every tool was on loan from God, managed by the armarius. There was a strict rule regarding the division of labor. The scribe was strictly a copyist. He was not an editor. He was not an author. His job was to replicate the text exactly as it appeared in the exemplar, errors and all. If the armarius handed you a book that contained a misspelling, you copied the misspelling. To correct it on your own authority was a sin of pride. You were assuming you knew better than the source. However, the armarius himself acted as the editor-in-chief. After a quaturn, a booklet of 4 folded sheets, creating 16 pages, was finished. It was handed to the armarius for the probatio, the proofreading. This was a tense process. The armarius would sit at his own desk, often near the window for the best light, and read the copy against the original. He read letter by letter, not word by word. If he found an error, a skipped word, a line repeated twice, a common error known as ditography, or a misspelling, he would mark it in the margin with a light lead point. The manuscript was then returned to the scribe for correction. This is where the knife came into play again. The scribe had to scrape away the top layer of the skin to erase the word. If the error was huge, if he had skipped an entire paragraph. The situation was dire. You could not scrape away a whole paragraph without ruining the structural integrity of the page. In these cases, the scribe might have to insert a small piece of parchment patch, or the page would be discarded entirely. For the scribe, a discarded page was a disaster. It meant the death of a calf had been in vain. It meant hours of labor wasted. The penalties for excessive errors were real. In some strict Cistercian houses, a scribe who made too many mistakes was forced to fast on bread and water, or was banned from the scriptorium and sent to work in the fields, digging turnips in the cold mud, a punishment that could ruin the sensitivity of his hands forever. But the hierarchy extended even beyond the armarius. In larger, more commercial scriptoriums of the later Middle Ages, particularly in university towns like Paris or Bologna, we see the rise of the stationer. The stationer was a lay businessman, not a monk, but he fulfilled a similar role. He managed the Petia system. As universities grew, students needed textbooks, but they couldn't afford to buy a whole handwritten Bible. So the stationer would break the book down into unbound sections called pecha, pieces. A student or a hired scribe would rent just one piece, copy it, return it, and rent the next one. The stationer sat in his shop, managing a library of fragmented books, ensuring that piece number 4 came back before he rented it to the next student. Back in the monastery, there were also the specialists who outranked the common scribe in artistic status, if not in administrative power, the rubricator and the illuminator. The scribe would leave blank spaces for these specialists. He would write the text in black, but where a new chapter began, he would leave a square empty. Sometimes, to ensure the artist knew what letter to put there, the scribe would write a tiny, microscopic letter in the margin or in the center of the box. These are called guide letters. You can still see them in medieval manuscripts today. A giant, beautiful gold T covering a tiny scribbled T underneath it. The rubricator came next. His name comes from the red ochre he used. He was responsible for the visual navigation of the book. He painted the chapter headings, the initial letters, and the paragraph marks, the pilcrow. His work turned a wall of text into a navigable document. He worked fast, moving through the stack of finished pages, adding splashes of red and blue. Then, the illuminator. He was the artist. He applied the gold leaf. This was a process of extreme delicacy. First, he would apply a base of gesso, a plaster mixed with glue, to raise the letter off the page. Then, he would breathe on the gesso to make it slightly tacky with the moisture of his breath. He would lay a flake of gold leaf, thin as air, onto the plaster and burnish it with a dog's tooth or a piece of smooth agate until it shone like a mirror. The illuminator worked separately, often with his own expensive pigments, and was sometimes a traveling professional hired specifically for one great book. But the scribe remained the anchor. The armarius might manage the keys, and the illuminator might bring the glory, but the scribe brought the substance. The relationship between the armarius and the scribe was one of constant, silent friction. The armarius demanded speed, the scribe required time. The armarius demanded economy of materials, the scribe needed space to write clearly. There are records of scribes leaving notes complaining about their armarius. They called them taskmasters or penny pinchers. But there was also a shared sense of mission. When the book was finally done, when the last sheet was scraped and the last period placed, the armarius and the scribe would often write a colophon together at the end of the book. The colophon was the credit sequence of the Middle Ages. It was a paragraph at the very end, where the scribe was finally allowed to speak in his own voice. It is here that the hierarchy dissolves slightly, and we see the human behind the production line. They would write things like, "The book is finished. Let the writer be given a goose and a drink." Or, more piously, "Whoever reads this book, pray for the soul of Brother Matthew, who wrote it in the year of our Lord 1245. The almarius would check this colophon, approve it, and then take the unbound sheaf of papers. He would walk them to the bindery, the next stage of the assembly line. The scribe's work was done. He would return to his desk, pick up his knife, and wait for the almarius to bring the next blank skin. The hierarchy reset. The cycle began again. But the perfect page is a myth. No matter how tempered the quill, how smooth the vellum, or how pious the monk, the human hand is fallible. And in the scriptorium, an error is not merely a mistake. It is a physical wound in the flesh of the book. To understand the weight of an error, you must remember the cost. By the time the scribe reaches the middle of a page, that single sheet of skin represents the life of a calf, weeks of tanning, days of preparation, and perhaps 10 hours of writing. To discard it because of a spelling mistake is not an option. It would be an act of gluttonous waste. So the scribe must become a surgeon. The most feared enemy of the scribe is not the ink blot or the shaky hand. It is the eye skip. The technical term for this is homeoteliouton, from the Greek for same ending. It is a mechanical failure of the eyes caused by the repetitive nature of the text itself. Imagine you are copying the Gospel of John. You are writing a Latin sentence that ends with the words Spiritus Sanctus. You dip your quill, look down at your own page to form the letters, and then look back up at the exemplar to find your place. Your eye naturally scans for the last words you wrote, Spiritus Sanctus. But 3 lines further down the page, the text also contains the phrase Spiritus Sanctus. Your eye grabs onto this second occurrence, assuming it is the first. You continue writing from that point. In doing so, you have just obliterated 3 lines of scripture. You have effectively deleted a thought of God. This is the eye skip. It is silent. The scribe rarely notices it when it happens. He might write for another hour, filling the rest of the column, before he pauses to stretch his neck, reads back his work, and feels the blood drain from his face. The sentence makes no sense. The gap is there, invisible but undeniable. There are other, smaller gremlins, of course. There is ditography, the accidental repetition of a word or letter, writing Dominus Dominus instead of just Dominus. This often happens when the scribe is interrupted. Perhaps the bell rings for sext, or a brother coughs, and when he returns to the page, he repeats the last motion his muscle remembers. Then there is haplography, the opposite error, where he writes a letter once when it should be written twice. In the picket fence script of black letter, where M, N, U, and I all look like identical vertical strokes, skipping a single stroke can turn annus, year, into anus, old woman ring, a mortifying change of meaning in a sacred text. So how is the wound healed? If the ink is still wet, the scribe acts fast. He does not use a rag, which would smear the ink into a grey ghost. He uses his tongue. The saliva of a fasting monk was jokingly said to be the best eraser, but in reality, it is the enzymes in saliva that help break down the gum Arabic binder in the ink. He licks his finger and lifts the ink off the grease-free surface of the vellum. It is gross, but effective. But if the error is discovered after the ink has dried, hours or days later, the process becomes violent. The scribe picks up the rosorium or novaculum. This is a specialized scraping knife, distinct from the penknife. It has a rounded, wide blade, not unlike a modern chisel. The scribe does not rub the mistake. He shaves the skin. He gently scrapes the surface of the parchment, peeling away the layer of collagen that holds the ink. Scritch, scritch, scritch. The sound is distinctive, a dry, rasping noise that travels through the quiet room. Every head in the scriptorium knows that sound. It is the sound of failure. He must be careful. If he scrapes too deep, he weakens the skin. The parchment becomes translucent, a window that you can see through to the writing on the other side. If he scrapes too vigorously, he might punch a hole right through the page. Once the black ink is removed, the spot is rough and hairy. The fibers of the dermis have been disturbed. If he tried to write on it immediately, the fresh ink would bleed into the fuzzy fibers, creating a spiderweb effect. So he must rebuild the surface. He takes the hare's foot, a literal dried paw of a rabbit used as a brush, and rubs pounce, powdered sandarac resin or cuttlefish bone, into the scraped hollow. Then he burnishes it with a smooth agate stone or a tooth until it is shiny and hard again. Only then can he write the correct word over the ghost of the error. But what if the error is an omission? What if he skipped a whole line? He cannot scrape away a blank space. He cannot stretch the skin to make room for the missing sentence. For this, the medieval scribe developed a system of hypertext that predates the internet by 1,000 years. He uses the signe de renvoi, literally the sign of return. In the modern world, we use an asterisk. The medieval scribe used a vast vocabulary of tie marks. He might draw a tiny cross, or a double slash, or a stylized flower at the exact point in the text where the missing line belongs. Then he moves his hand to the margin. The margins of medieval books were wide for a reason. They were the error buffers. In the margin, he draws the matching symbol and then writes the missing text in a smaller, tighter script. If the omission is small, just a word or two, he might use a caret, from the Latin carere, to lack. This looks exactly like the symbol we use today, or placed under the line to point up to the insertion. However, sometimes the scribe writes something he didn't mean to, but he doesn't want to scrape it out because the parchment is too thin or the text is too dense. He cannot cross it out with a line. That looks messy and secular. Instead, he uses subpuncting. Subpuncting is a method of deletion that is both elegant and passive-aggressive. The scribe places a series of tiny, perfect dots directly under the letters he wishes to delete. D-O-M-I-N-U-S. These dots tell the reader, I wrote this, but you should ignore it. It admits the mistake without destroying the beauty of the page layout. It preserves the rhythm of the black block of text while signaling the error to the mind. There is a psychological toll to this constant vigilance. The fear of error was so prevalent that it birthed a demon. His name was Titivillus. Titivillus was not a grand demon of hell like Lucifer. He was a bureaucratic demon, a patron spirit of the scriptorium's anxiety. The monks believed, or told stories claiming, that Titivillus wandered the monastery with a sack over his shoulder. His job was to collect the dropped letters, the skipped syllables, and the mumbled words of the service. Every time a scribe committed a homoteleuton, Titivillus snatched the missing words and stuffed them into his sack. Every day, he had to find 1,000 errors to take back to hell. If the sack wasn't full, he would pinch the monks to make them sleepy or knock over their inkhorns. This mythology was a coping mechanism. It externalized the fault. It wasn't me who fell asleep. It was Tidavillus who weighed down my eyelids. It gave a name to the invisible force of entropy that seemed to haunt the scriptorium. And yet, despite the scraping and the subpuncting, some errors were simply too large to fix. Imagine a scribe who has copied an entire page, front and back, only to realize that he turned 2 pages of the exemplar at once. He has skipped an entire chapter. The text on his page flows perfectly, but it is missing a massive chunk of the narrative in the middle. He cannot write it in the margin. There is no room. In this catastrophe, the Armarius might order the ultimate reset, the palimpsest. The word comes from the Greek palin again, and sestos, scraped. To make a palimpsest is to recycle the page entirely. The scribe takes the finished sheet, the one he spent days on, and immerses it in milk and oat bran to soften the ink. Then, he takes the pumice stone and scrubs the entire page blank. He erases God. He scrubs until the words fade into grey shadows, until the history is deleted. Then he whitens it with chalk and starts again. But ink is stubborn. The iron in the gall ink bites deep. Over centuries, the erased text often begins to re-emerge, ghost-like, from the depths of the skin as the iron oxidizes. Today, with multispectral imaging, we can read these palimpsests. We can look beneath the surface of a 13th century prayer book and find the faint, scraped-away text of an ancient Greek mathematical treatise or a pagan law code that a monk decided was less important than the prayers he needed to write. The error, in the end, is never truly gone. It is just buried. The scribe finishes his correction. He burnishes the patch of scraped skin. He blows away the dust of the vellum. He dips his pen. The picket fence resumes. Minim, minim, minim. He has survived the error. But now the light is fading, and the page must be finished before the bell rings. And once the writing is done, the sheet is not a book. It is just a loose leaf. It must be gathered, sewn, and bound in oak and leather. A pile of parchment is not a book. It is merely a stack of skin. It is vulnerable to humidity, which makes it curl, and to light, which makes it brittle. To survive the centuries, these loose leaves must be engineered into a machine. We leave the quiet hum of the scriptorium now and move to the bindery. The atmosphere changes. The smell of ink and wax is replaced by the heavier, earthier sense of sawdust, boiled bone glue, and oak. The silence here is different. It is punctuated by the rhythmic thump of a hammer and the swish of a wax thread. The binder is often a different monk, or perhaps a lay craftsman who lives within the abbey walls. He is a carpenter of words. His job is to build a fortress around the text. The construction begins with the gathering. The scribe has delivered the sheets in loose groups. Remember, he did not write on page 1, then page 2. He wrote on a large, unfolded sheet that would eventually be folded to create 4, 8, or 16 pages. The binder takes these large sheets and folds them. If he folds a skin once, it is a folio. 2 leaves, 4 pages. If he folds it again, it is a quarto. If he folds it again, an octavo. He groups these folded sheets into packets called quires, from the Latin quaterni, meaning 4 each, though the number varied. A standard quire consists of 4 folded sheets nestled inside each other, creating 16 pages of text. But here lies a danger. If the binder mixes up the order of the quires, the book is ruined. There are no page numbers. Pagination is a modern invention. Instead, the binder looks for the catchword. At the very bottom right corner of the last page of a quire, The scribe has written the first word of the next choir. The binder reads this tiny word, principium, and finds the next packet that starts with principium. He matches them. It is a slow, methodical matching game, ensuring the stream of thought remains unbroken. Once the choirs are collated, the sewing begins. The binder sits before a sewing frame. This is a simple wooden structure, like a small loom. It consists of a flat wooden base and a crossbar held up by two threaded uprights. Between the base and the crossbar, the binder stretches vertical supports. These are not thin threads. They are thick, heavy cords made of hemp, or sometimes thongs cut from white, alum-tawed pigskin. These cords are the skeleton of the book. They are the ribs. The binder takes the first choir. He opens it to the center fold. He lays it against the vertical cords. He takes a needle, threaded with unbleached linen thread that has been pulled through a block of beeswax to make it slick and water-resistant. He passes the needle from the inside of the choir out through the spine, wrapping it around the heavy leather, cord, and then back in, out, around, in. He moves down the spine, catching every vertical cord. When he reaches the end of the choir, he ties a kettle stitch, a corruption of the German Kettenstich, or chain stitch. This knot anchors the thread before he lays the next choir on top. He repeats this for every packet. Stack, sew, loop, knot, stack, sew, loop, knot. It is a motion of infinite repetition. The stack of choirs grows vertically, climbing up the chords. The tension must be perfect. Too loose, and the book will gape when opened. Too tight, and the pages will snap when turned. The binder pulls the thread with a sharp tug, snap, locking the choirs into a single solid text block. When the sewing is done, the book is a brick of vellum, but it is soft. The spine is just a row of exposed loops. It needs a spine of glue. The glue used in a medieval bindery is hide glue or bone glue. It is made by boiling down the connective tissues, hooves, and scraps of animals in a designated pot that simmers constantly over a low fire. The smell is pungent, a thick, meaty aroma. The glue is kept hot. As it cools, it turns into a hard, amber-like resin. The binder paints this hot, brown sludge onto the spine of the book. He works it in between the choirs with a stiff brush. As it dries, it remains slightly flexible, allowing the book to open, but tough enough to hold the gathered skins together. While the glue sets, the binder turns to the carpentry. He picks up a plank of oak. In the modern world, hardcover books are made of cardboard covered in paper. In the Middle Ages, they were made of wood. Genuine quarter-sawn oak, beech or pine, often a full centimeter thick. These are the boards. The binder measures the text block and saws the wood to size. But he does not leave the edges sharp. He uses a rasp to bevel the edges, sloping them gently down. This is not just for aesthetics. It is so the leather cover will not tear against a sharp corner. Now comes the lacing in. This is the moment the text and the cover become one. The thick leather cords, or thongs, that the scribe sewed the pages onto are left dangling from the spine. Long, loose tails. The binder drills tunnels into the edge of the oak boards. He threads the hemp cords through these tunnels, pulling them deep into the wood. To lock them in place, he drills a second hole and hammers a wooden peg, a tree whip, into the hole, wedging the cord against the oak. He saws off the excess peg and sands it flush. The book is now structurally integrated. You cannot rip the cover off without destroying the spine. The wood and the vellum are fused. Now, the dressing. The book is naked, just wood and skin. It needs a skin of its own. The covering material depends on the budget. For a utilitarian library book, it might be alum tawed skin. This is not tanned leather. Tanning uses oak bark and turns skin brown. Tarring uses alum salts and turns the skin a brilliant snowy white. It is incredibly durable. It can last 1,000 years without rotting, but it is stiff. For a luxury book, the binder uses tanned calfskin or goat skin, dyed red or brown. He pastes the leather with rye flour paste, a simple sticky starch. He lays the leather over the wooden boards, working out the air bubbles with a bone folder, a smooth tool made from the rib of a cow. He must work the leather around the raised bands on the spine. The thick sewing cords create bumps on the spine of the book. Instead of hiding them, the binder emphasizes them. He pinches the leather around the cords, creating the raised bands that we still associate with fancy encyclopedias today. Once the leather is dry, the decoration begins. But this is not the gold stamping of the Renaissance. This is blind tooling. The binder takes a metal stamp set into a wooden handle. The end of the stamp has a design cut into it, a fleur-de-lis, a dragon, a rose, or a geometric weave. He heats the tool over a charcoal brazier until it sizzles when touched with a wet finger. He presses the hot metal into the damp leather. Hiss. The heat darkens the leather and compresses the fibers, leaving a permanent, debossed impression. He builds up complex patterns, stamping one small flower after another to create a border, a frame, or a central diamond. It is dark on dark, subtle, tactile, but the book is not finished. Vellum has a memory. It wants to return to the shape of the animal. It wants to curl. If you leave a parchment book sitting on a table, the pages will absorb moisture from the air and buckle, forcing the book to yawn open. A vellum book must be kept under pressure. Enter the blacksmith. The binder attaches clasps. These are brass or bronze straps hinged to the back cover, which reach around to the front cover and clip onto a metal pin. They function like a belt. To close the book, you must squeeze it shut and latch the clasp. Click. The clasp forces the oak boards to squeeze the parchment pages flat, pressing the air out and keeping the humidity stable. A medieval book without clasps is a ruined book. Finally, the hardware. The binder hammers bosses into the corners and the center of the covers. These are metal bumps or studs. Why? Because books were not stored vertically. They were stored lying flat on their sides. If you slide a leather book across a rough wooden shelf, you scratch the leather. The bosses act as feet. The book glides on the metal studs, protecting the leather cover from friction. And now, for the most valuable books, comes the final, heavy addition, the chain. In a communal library, books are too valuable to be walked away with. A single volume represents the output of a small economy, so the liber catenatus, chained book, system is used. The blacksmith forges a staple, a U-shaped metal bracket. The binder rivets this staple to the top or bottom edge of the back wooden board, never the spine, which is too weak. To this staple, a chain is attached. The links are long and rod-like to prevent tangling. The chain is perhaps 3 feet long. At the other end, it attaches to a horizontal iron rod that runs along the bookshelf. The reader cannot take the book to his cell. He must come to the book. He pulls the volume off the shelf and lays it on the lectern below. The chain rattles as it slides along the rod. He is tethered to the text. The binder runs his hand over the cover. He feels the ridges of the spine, the coolness of the brass bosses, the grain of the oak beneath the leather. He smells the rye paste and the beeswax. He closes the clasps. The book is heavy, dense, and solid. It is no longer a collection of thoughts. It is a physical object, ready to withstand fire, flood, and the slow erosion of time. He places it on the pile. The bell rings for vespers. The book is now a finished object. It is a brick of oak and skin, heavy enough to kill a man if dropped, yet fragile enough to rot if left in the damp. It leaves the bindery and travels to its final resting place, the librarium. In the modern mind, a library is a place of browsing. It is a place of open stacks where one might wander, pull a volume from a shelf, flip through it, and put it back. The medieval library permitted no such casual intimacy. It was a fortress of knowledge, designed not for the convenience of the reader, but for the preservation of the object. We enter the library. It is usually situated above the scriptorium or the sacristy to protect it from the rising damp of the ground. The air here is drier, colder, and still. The smell is distinct. It lacks the sharp chemical bite of the ink or the meaty stench of the glue. It smells only of dust, old wood, and the faint metallic tang of oxidized iron. There are no rows of freestanding bookshelves. Instead, the room is filled with lectern systems or presses. Imagine a long, sloping wooden desk, like a church pew for standing at. Above the desk runs a heavy iron rod. Below the rod sit the books. They do not stand vertically, spine out, as they do today. They lie flat on their sides, resting on the sloping wood. This is the home of the libri catenati, the chained books. The logic of the chain is simple economics. A single large glossed Bible might cost the equivalent of a herd of cows or the stone to build a small chapel. Theft was a catastrophic loss. Thus the book is treated as a prisoner. Let us examine the mechanism of the chain, for it is a specific piece of blacksmithing. The chain attaches to the foredge of the cover, the edge opposite the spine. This seems counterintuitive to us. If you chain the spine, the book can be pulled out easily. But if you chain the foredge, you can flip the book open without the chain tangling across the pages. The chain links are long and narrow, often twisted into a figure 8 shape to prevent kinking. They are made of wrought iron. When a monk wishes to read, he does not take the book to a comfortable chair. He walks to the lectern. He pulls the book up from the shelf below onto the reading slope. Clank, rattle, thud. The sound of a medieval library is not silence. It is the sound of iron sliding against iron rods. The monk stands or sits on a hard bench, tethered to the spot. The chain is just long enough to allow the book to lie open, but short enough that it cannot be moved to the next desk. The reader is physically anchored to the text. The security system that holds these chains is ingenious. The iron rod that runs the length of the shelf is secured at one end by a hasp and a padlock. The armarius, our head librarian, wears the key on his belt. To add or remove a book, he must unlock the padlock, slide the entire rod out of the shelf through a series of metal loops, thread the ring of the book's chain onto the rod, and then slide the heavy bar back in, locking it shut. It is a mechanism of total control, but not all books were chained. The library was divided. There was the reference collection, chained, immobile, for consultation, and the circulating collection, unlocked for lending. The lending rules were governed by the rhythm of the seasons, specifically the Rule of Saint Benedict, chapter 48. This rule dictated the intellectual metabolism of the monastery. It was slow, glacially slow. The great event of the library year occurred on the first Monday of Lent. This was the day of the Renovatio Librorum, the renewal of the books. The entire community of monks gathers in the chapter house. The armarius enters, followed by his assistants carrying the books that have been returned. A large carpet is spread on the floor. The ceremony begins with a roll call. The armarius reads from his ledger. He calls out a name, Brother Thomas. Brother Thomas steps forward. He holds the book he was loaned exactly 1 year ago. He places it on the carpet. The armarius inspects it. Is the binding intact? Is there candle wax on the pages? Has the vellum warped from damp? If the book is damaged, Brother Thomas must do penance, perhaps prostrating himself on the floor or fasting. Then the terrifying question, did you finish it? If Brother Thomas has read the book completely, he is cleared. But if he has not finished it, if he spent a whole year with a single volume of St. Augustine and failed to reach the end, he must confess his slothfulness. He asks for pardon on his knees. Once the book is returned, Brother Thomas does not browse for a new one. The armarius hands him his reading for the next year. Think about that. 1 book, 1 year. This changes the nature of reading entirely. You do not skim. You do not read for plot. You inhabit the book. You read a sentence, and then you meditate on it for an hour. You memorize entire chapters. You analyze the shape of the letters. You become intimate with the flaws in the parchment. The hole on page 40 where the cow had a scar. The tea-colored stain on the page 102. The book becomes a roommate. The cataloguing system for these books was not based on the Dewey Decimal System or alphabetical order. It was based on the second leaf rule, or dictio probatoria. Because books were copied by hand, no 2 copies were identical. If you had 2 copies of the same book, say 2 copies of The City of God, the text on page 1 would be the same. But because one scribe wrote smaller than the other, by the time you turned the page to the second leaf, page 3 in modern terms, the first word on that page would be different. So the catalogue did not say Book 4, City of God. It said, Book 4, City of God. Second leaf begins with gloriam. This was the unique fingerprint of that specific physical object. If the physical chains were not enough to deter theft, the library had a secondary spiritual layer of security, the anathema, the book curse. Scribes and librarians knew that a book was a portable treasure. A thief could cut the chain with bolt cutters or simply slice the pages out of the binding and run. So they inscribed curses on the first page of the book. These were not subtle warnings. They were legal contracts with the Almighty. A typical curse, written in red ink at the front of a Bible, might read, "This book belongs to the monastery of St. Albans. Whoever steals it, or removes it from this place, or conceals it, let him be anathema. Let him be erased from the book of life. Let him be suspended in hell forever alongside Judas the traitor." Some were more creative and visceral. Whoever steals this book, let him die the death. Let him be frizzled in a pan. May the falling sickness, epilepsy, and fevers attack him, and may he be broken on the wheel and hanged. Amen. These curses were believed to be effective. To steal a book was not just a crime against the monastery. It was a crime against the saint to whom the monastery was dedicated. If you stole a book from St. Peter's monastery, St. Peter himself was coming for you. For the monks who worked in the library, the silence was absolute. But communication was necessary. So they developed the signa loquendi, the language of signs. If a monk needed a specific book, he did not whisper. He made a sign. To ask for a missal, mass book, he would make the sign of the cross. To ask for a Gospels, he would make the sign of the cross on his forehead. To ask for a Psalter, Book of Psalms, he would place his hands on his head in the shape of a crown, referencing King David, the author of the Psalms. But what if he wanted a book by a pagan author? A classic work of history by Tacitus or philosophy by Aristotle. The church respected these books, but they were not holy. To ask for a pagan book, the monk would scratch his ear with his finger, like a dog scratching for fleas. The implication was clear. The pagan author was, like a dog, an animal without a soul. Yet the librarian would nod, unlock the rod, and slide the heavy, flea-bitten volume down the lectern. As the sun sets, the armarius makes his final rounds. He checks the chains. He ensures the clasps are locked. If a book is left unclamped, the humidity of the night will warp the vellum, causing the book to yawn open like a dead clam. A warped book cannot be stacked. It is a ruined tool. He walks down the rows of lecterns. The iron rods gleam dully in the lantern light. The books are sleeping beasts, chained to their posts. He reaches the door, steps out, and turns the heavy iron key in the lock. The library is sealed. Inside, the only sound is the settling of the oak beams and the faint, microscopic crackle of parchment adjusting to the temperature drop. The words are safe. The ink is biting into the skin. The year-long cycle of reading continues. One page, one day, one prayer at a time. For centuries, the rhythm of the scriptorium remained unchanged. Minim, minim, minim. The scrape of the knife, the rustle of the skin. It was a technology of biological silence, dependent on the breeding of calves and the patience of monks. But in the late 14th and early 15th centuries, a new texture began to infiltrate the copying rooms. It did not come from the pasture, it came from the gutter. It was paper. To the master scribes of the high medieval period, paper was a suspicious, foreign substance. They called it cloth parchment, or, more derisively, mere scraps. Unlike the noble vellum, which was the skin of a living creature, paper was the resurrected ghost of discarded linen. The arrival of paper marks the beginning of the end for the quiet shift of the scribe, but the process of its creation is a routine of industrial hypnosis in its own right. Let us step away from the scriptorium for a moment and stand by the river, at the paper mill. The raw material is not wood. Wood pulp paper is a 19th century invention that will eventually turn yellow and brittle. The paper of the late Middle Ages is made from rags, old hemp ropes, worn-out linen tunics, and discarded underwear. The life of a sheet of paper begins with the rag picker, a scavenger who walks the muddy streets of the growing cities, collecting the white refuse of society. These rags are sold to the mill, where they undergo a violent purification. They are washed, sorted, and then left to rot in wet piles for days. This fermentation breaks down the fibers. Then the water wheel turns. The heart of the paper mill is the stamping mill. A camshaft, driven by the river, lifts and drops heavy wooden hammers shod with iron nails. Thud, splash, thud, splash. Day and night, these hammers beat the rotting rags in troughs of water until they disintegrate into a creamy, white, oatmeal-like soup called stuff or pulp. The papermaker stands at a vat of this warm, milky liquid. His work is a dance of water and wire. He holds a mold, a rectangular wooden frame fitted with a wire mesh screen. He dips the mold into the vat, scoops up a layer of the pulp, and lifts it out. As he lifts it, he gives it the vatman's shake, a specific two-way jiggle, left-right, forward-back, that locks the fibers together as the water drains through the mesh. If you hold a piece of medieval paper up to the light today, you can see the ghost of this wire mesh. You will see thin horizontal lines called laid lines and thicker vertical lines called chain lines. You might also see a watermark, a bull's head, a crown, or a cluster of grapes created by a piece of wire sewn onto the screen, which makes the paper slightly thinner and more translucent in that shape. The wet sheet is couched, pressed, onto a felt blanket. A stack is built, paper, felt, and then squeezed in a giant screw press to wring out the water. Finally, the sheets are hung over ropes in a loft to dry, like laundry. But this paper acts like a sponge. If a scribe tried to write on it now, the ink would blot. So it must be sized. The dry sheets are dipped into a hot tub of gelatin, animal glue made from boiled hooves and skin parings. This seals the surface, giving the pen something to glide on. At first, the scribes resisted. Paper was considered fragile. It tore easily. It was for drafts, letters, and accounts, not for the Word of God. A Bible was forever. Paper was for now. But paper had one devastating advantage. It was cheap. You did not need to slaughter a herd of cows to make a book. You just needed the city's old shirts. By the 1440s, the price of the writing surface had plummeted. The stage was set, the fuel was ready. All that was needed was the spark. That spark was struck in Mainz in Germany by a goldsmith named Johannes Gutenberg. Gutenberg did not invent printing. Woodblock printing had existed in Asia for centuries. Gutenberg's genius was in the movable type. He treated the alphabet not as a fluid script, but as a kit of interchangeable parts. He was not a scribe, he was a metallurgist. The transition from the scribe to the compositor is a shift from the organic to the mechanical. The scribe works with the flow of the hand. The compositor works with the grid of the machine. Let us enter the printing shop of the late 15th century. The silence of the scriptorium is gone. This room is loud. It smells of oil, varnish, and sweat. The process begins with the punch. A master craftsman carves a letter, a backward A, onto the end of a hard steel rod. This is the only time true artistry is required. He hammers this hard steel punch into a softer block of copper, creating a sunken impression called the matrix. The matrix is the mold. It is placed into a handheld casting device. The caster pours in the type metal, a precise alloy of lead, tin, and antimony. Lead cools quickly. Tin allows the metal to flow into the tiny corners of the mold. Antimony expands as it cools, ensuring the letter edges are razor sharp. Pour, snap, eject. The caster produces a letter, then another, then 1,000. He creates a bucket full of E's, a bucket of A's. These are the sorts. Now the compositor takes over. He stands before the type case. 2 large wooden trays divided into compartments. The upper case holds the capital letters, hence uppercase. The lower case holds the small letters, lowercase. His hand moves like a bird pecking at seeds. He grabs a letter, checks the notch on the side to ensure it's right side up without looking, and slides it into a composing stick held in his left hand. He builds the line of text, letter by letter, backwards, KCILC. When the line is almost full, he has to justify it. In the scriptorium, the scribe compressed his handwriting to make the margin straight. The compositor inserts thin metal spacers between the words until the line is perfectly tight against the walls of the stick. He transfers the lines to a galley, a metal tray, and locks them into a heavy iron frame called a chase. This heavy slab of lead text is the form. The ink has changed too. The water-based iron gall ink of the scribe would bead up on the metal type. The printer needs something sticky. He boils linseed oil until it catches fire, then mixes it with lampblack, soot, and varnish. This is printer's ink, a thick black sludge that takes days to dry. The beater takes 2 leather balls stuffed with wool, smears them with ink, and pounds them onto the face of the type. Thump, thump, thump. The type glistens black. The puller places a damp sheet of paper onto the tympan, a hinge frame, folds it down, rolls the carriage under the heavy wooden screw of the press, and pulls the bar. This is the pressman's yank. It requires 200 pounds of force. The wooden platen descends. It presses the damp paper onto the inked lead with crushing weight. The paper fibers are forced around the edges of the letters, creating a bite, a tactile indentation that you can feel with your finger. Creak, clunk, release. He pulls the bar back. He rolls the carriage out. He lifts the paper. In the time it took a scribe to write the word Genesis, the press has produced 2 full pages of it. The impact was cataclysmic. In 1455, the Gutenberg Bible was printed. By 1500, there were millions of printed books in Europe. These early printed books are called incunabula, from the Latin for swaddling clothes or cradle. But here is the irony. The first printers did not want to look like machines. They wanted to look like scribes. The early typefaces were not the clean Roman fonts we use today. They were black letter, identical to the textura script of the monks. They copied the ligatures. They copied the density. They even left blank spaces for the red letters. For a brief twilight period, perhaps 50 years, the scribe and the printer coexisted in a strange hybrid economy. The press would print the black text, and the sheets would be sent to the monastery. There, the scribe, now demoted to a rubricator, would manually paint in the red headers and the blue initials. The machine provided the body, the human provided the soul. But the economics were ruthless. A handwritten Bible cost years of wages. A printed Bible cost weeks. The scriptorium, as a factory of books, began to starve. The armaria stopped buying vellum. The herds of calves were left to grow into cows. The inkhorns dried up. The great desks, polished by centuries of elbows, grew dusty. Some scribes fought back. In 1492, the abbot Trithemius of Sponheim wrote a treatise titled De Laude Scriptorum, in praise of scribes. He argued that writing on parchment was an act of devotion, while printing on paper was soulless. He wrote, "The printed book is made of paper, and like paper, will quickly disappear. But the scribe writing on parchment ensures lasting remembrance for himself and his text." The irony? Trithemius had to have his book printed on a press so that enough people would read his complaint about printing. By the mid-16th century, the profession was dead. The scrivener survived only in the legal trade, copying deeds and contracts where a unique human hand was legally required, or as a writing master teaching the wealthy how to sign their names. The great monastic production line, the 14-hour day of silence, geometry and prayer, was dismantled. The quiet shift moved from the scriptorium to the print shop, but the new shift was not quiet. It was a cacophony of clattering type, roaring fires for drying damp paper, and the rhythmic creak thump of the wooden presses. The printer's devil, the apprentice, replaced the novice monk. The smell of incense was replaced by the smell of solvent. The handwritten era, which had preserved human knowledge through the collapse of empires and the dark of the Middle Ages, ended not with a bang, but with a mechanical clunk. And yet, the legacy remains. When you look at your computer screen today, you see uppercase and lowercase, terms from the wooden trays of the compositor. When you read a book, you hold pages of wood pulp that mimic the size of the sheepskin folio. We are still living in the architecture built by the scribe, even if the builder has long since left the room. The candle in the scriptorium flickers one last time. The scribe scrapes his final error. He closes the heavy oak cover. He engages the brass clasp. Click. The work is done. The ink is dry. Thank you for joining me on this long shift through the centuries. We have mixed the ink, scrapped the skin, sewn the cords, chained the iron, and finally turned the wheel of the press. This has been The Quiet Shift. If this deep dive into the mundane history of labor helped you find a moment of stillness, please consider subscribing. In our next broadcast, we will fast forward to the 19th century to explore the lonely, fog-drenched routine of the Victorian lamplighter, walking the streets of London to push back the dark. Until then, sleep well.